All right, so today's notes are going to be over two-step equations and inequalities. So before we go over this, please remember you have to have a strong foundation with one step in order to be okay with two-step. So let's talk about our goal with two-step equations. It's actually the same as one step. So we are trying to get the variable by itself on one side of the equation or inequality. So for two-step, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and go over both equations and inequalities today. We are going to use inverse operations in order to solve. So just like before. So to refresh your memory, let's take a look at one-step equations. Okay, so for one-step equations, all right, our process was to draw the line and then circle our variable. Look at what's happening. We see a -4, so the opposite is +4. So the 4's cancel. I have x left over, and 7 plus 4 gives me 11. So x equals 11. The problem below, 2x equals -10. Well, remember, 2x, draw my line, circle my variable, means multiplication, so I must do the opposite, which is to divide. So I divide by 2, and I get x equals -5. Now, inequalities, all right? When we had inequalities and you had multiplication or division, you had to ask yourself something. You had to ask yourself, do I flip my sign? In this situation, once I draw my line, circle the variable, I see this -2 is attached to the variable. Therefore, I'd have to flip my sign at the end. Now I can solve like normal, where I multiply by -2, and I would have x is greater than -12. So that's how we took care of one step. Now let's talk about the steps in solving two-step equations and inequalities. All right, so our first step is kind of going to be the same. We want to circle the variable, and whatever is next to it or in front of it. We'll talk about what that means shortly. The second step is we're going to use inverse operations to undo what is not circled. And in step 3, we will use inverse operations to undo what is circled. So with one step, we only had to use inverse operations one time. For two-step, we're going to have to do this twice, which is why it's called two-step equations. So here is a basic example of what you'll see. Okay, so we're going to approach this the same way we would with one step. Draw your line. Now, instead of just circling the variable, here it is, I want to also circle what's attached to it. So that -2 is attached. Now I can move on to step 2. I want to do the inverse of what is not circled. Well, looking here, +8 is not circled. So the opposite or inverse would be to subtract 8. And I'm going to do this from both sides. So now on the left side, I have left over -2x. And 14 minus 8 gives me 6. Now, I'm not done, okay? X is not by itself. But this now looks like a one-step problem. Now I can go ahead and continue like normal. I see multiplication. So the opposite is to divide. So I'll divide by -2. So I would have x equals -3. Now, you can always go through and check your answer by replacing the variable. All right. So to do that, I just replace the -3 with the x. So I have -2 times -3 plus 8 equals 14. Now multiply, -2 times -3 is 6, so 6 plus 8 equals 14, and 6 plus 8 does equal 14, so this is a true statement, therefore that is my answer. All right, so solving inequalities is going to be the same process as that equation. So I'm going to start off by drawing my line, and then circle your variable and what's attached. So in this situation, I'm going to circle the m plus 4. So now look at what is not circled. Well, the 6 is not circled, and it's a positive, so the opposite is to subtract. That cancels, so I have m over 4 left over. 12 minus 6 gives me 6. Now I see division, so the opposite is to multiply, so I'm going to multiply both sides by 4. And I would have m is greater than 24. So here are some problems I would like for you to try on your own. So pause the video, and then you will check your work with mine. All right, so hopefully your paper looks something like mine. So on the first example, remember I would circle that 5x. So the minus 10 is not circled, so I do the opposite to both sides. I would then have to divide by 5, and I would get x is greater than 6. And then over here, I would circle w over -3. I see the minus 9, so the opposite is plus 9. And then I would multiply by -3, so I get w equals -75. Now, these are basic formats for equations and inequalities. There are going to be some different situations that we need to look at. So here are the first two. If you look at this first one, you see here, it basically looks like a fraction. So when I approach this problem, I'm going to draw my line, circle my variable and what's attached. Well, here I have the -5 with it, okay? Basically, when we have it written as a fraction, we are going to save the denominator for last, okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply both sides by 4. So I have x minus 5 is less than or equal to -3 times 4 is -12. Now I see the -5. I add 5 to both sides. And I get x is less than or equal to -7. So on this one, we have to be careful with, you cannot take care of anything in the numerator until you get rid of the denominator. All right, our next one, 2 minus x equals 4. Looking at this, you may say, why is this in here? It looks like a one step. Well, let's do our steps and figure out if it actually is or not. So I'm going to draw my line and circle my variable and what's in front of it. So now I see the 2, it's a positive, so the opposite is going to be to subtract. So on the left side, I'm going to bring down what was circled. I have negative x equals 4 minus 2 is 2. Now, when we're solving, we have to ask if x is on its own. Well, there's a negative with it. So since it's negative, okay, I cannot have a negative x. I have to make it a positive. In front of the x that we don't write is a 1. So technically this is -1x. And this means multiplication. So the opposite is going to be to divide, and we're going to divide by -1. So that cancels, so I have x equals -2. So because that x was negative, okay, that is why it's a two-step. All right, because I have to take it a step further and divide by that negative. All right, in our last situation, All right, looks maybe something like this, where we have a fraction attached to the variable. So I'm going to go through, draw my line, and circle what is attached. Okay. Proceed like normal. I see the 2 by itself, so the opposite is for me to subtract. So on the left side, I have negative 1/4 x equals 6. When you get to this part here, okay, you're like, oh, negative 1/4 x, that's multiplication. I agree. And you may say, you can divide. I agree. However, dividing by a fraction, especially with equations and inequalities, it's a little difficult. So instead, when we have a situation like this, we want to multiply by the reciprocal. And if you remember, reciprocal meant to flip. If you multiply by the reciprocal, it's going to make your life easier. So the reciprocal of negative 1/4 would be negative 4/1. I'm going to do that to both sides. So on the left, the fractions cancel, and I have x left over. And then 6 times negative 4 gives me negative 24. Okay, so once again, when you have, this is probably the hardest situation because we will forget to multiply by that reciprocal. All right, now the last thing. When we had one-step inequalities, if I had a negative attached and we had multiplication or division, I had to flip my sign. So we need to look at situations where we would flip our sign. Approach it by doing your steps, drawing your line, and circle your variable and what is attached. Look at your variable. I see a negative 2. Well, negative 2x means multiplication. Therefore, from our final answer, I will have to flip my sign. In the next one, 2 minus x is greater than or equal to negative 4, to 4. Draw your line and circle. Well, I have a negative attached to the variable. This tells me, once again, I would have to flip my symbol before I solve. In the last situation we have where we have to flip may look like this. So what I focused on the first two were about the circles. Okay, so here I draw my line and I circle my numerator. Well, what is circled, this doesn't tell me to flip. Okay, in this situation, what would tell me to flip is this negative 4. And the reason for that, x is being divided by a negative. Therefore, I would have to flip my inequality sign. If I had it written like this instead, a different problem, would I flip my sign? Well, in this case, I would because of the negative being divided by the variable. Okay, so it's very similar to this here. All right, so for today, you will not have a homework assignment. Okay, but please know there is always tutoring available for if you want to go over two-step equations and inequalities. Now, next class, we are going to talk about writing two-step equations and inequalities. So you have to be comfortable with solving before we get to that. Remember, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to your teacher.